up? James here from jamesdforsythe.com. And thought I'd actually listen to you guys and see, like, because I've noticed a lot of people were watching the student loan forgiveness video I did quite some time ago. So I thought I'd kind of do a little bit of an update. I found another post on the New York Fed's blog, um, basically talking about, like who would benefit, one of the studies that they did, and so on. So I thought I'd go over that a little bit more in depth because not only is it kind of a personal interest of mine, obviously, with just having finished college, and knowing quite a few people who their student loan debt is still a problem for them, even with how old they are, depending on how long they've been out and such. But yeah, anyways, we'll head right into the screen share. That one. Okay, I'll switch this. All right. Okay. So basically, one of the studies that they did is basically seeing who would actually benefit from student loan forgiveness in, like, varying amounts. So like, say they looked at if it was $10,000 forgiveness versus $50,000. They also tried it with a having an income cap. So like, if you make over, I think it was $75,000 a year, you wouldn't have forgiveness. But anyways, so the pandemic forbearance for federal student loans was recently extended for the sixth time. I didn't realize it was the sixth time. I haven't really paid much of attention to it, in terms of like how many times they've extended it. And so this is a 30-month pause on federal student loan payments. So that's what, 2.5 years. So I guess that makes sense. About 2.5 years ago when the pandemic started. So the results from the survey and the experience of some federal borrowers who did not receive forbearance during the pandemic suggest that delinquencies could surpass pre-pandemic levels after forbearance ends. So after this ends, maybe a lot of people won't be able to service their debt like they used to, or at least a higher proportion would not be able to. Um, so several studies, and they link them here, have attempted to quantify the cost and distribution of benefits of some of these policies. However, each of these studies either relies on data that do not fully capture the population that owes student loan debt, or does not separate student loans owned by the federal government from those owned by commercial banks, and thus not eligible for forgiveness. Right, and so pretty much all of the proposals for student loan forgiveness are about federal student debt, right? And so you really have to, like, okay, where is the debt coming from? And I think below they actually distinguish between there's two specific programs that would be forgiven, right? Um, Also, one of the things that they did that I mean, I guess I can kind of see the point, but it's also like, I don't understand why you don't just use the actual data. But they used representative data from basically anonymous credit reports, which makes perfect sense. You want it to be anonymous. But they only used three categories. Yeah. They used the borrower's age, their credit score, and their student loan balance. But they didn't observe their income or other demographic information. So they kind of just placed it into census block groups, is what they call it, and kind of simulated it from there rather than actually using the person's actual data, which I guess I understand from. I guess you could make an argument for the privacy of it, but it's like, that's already on the New York Fed Equifax Consumer Credit Panel. So it's like, I don't really see the point in ignoring that. Um, but whatever. And the two, they use direct loans, so those would be forgiven, and then the Family Federal Education Loan Program. So if you had stuff between either of those, and I think they also, like, they bought more or something. Um, Anyway, so one of the things that is kind of important for this is, how much would this forgiveness actually cost? And they're basically defining that on like how much would be in total forgiven. They're basically paying off the debt or just kind of going away with it. Which, when you look into how um like quote unquote money actually works nowadays, in terms of like you're probably paying with commercial bank liabilities, money in your bank account, to the federal government, essentially using maybe their own Federal Reserve equivalent. Um, so essentially just canceling out liabilities, and there's not really a transfer of anything. Um, so for it kind of just poof and goes away, just like a loan. It's a loan, just like your mortgage would when you pay down your mortgage. It's not that you're actually destroying the money supply whenever you're paying back your loan, right? Um, so back on the actual student loan forgiveness. So the total outstanding balance for federally owned, including defaulted student loans in December of 2021, so about 6 months ago, was 1.38 trillion. Um, and they looked at, if you limit the amount, the maximum for forgiveness to 50 grand per borrower, the cost would be 904 billion, which would forgive the full balance for about 79% of all federal borrowers. Um, Forgiveness for a maximum of up to 10 grand per borrower would be about 31% of federal student loan borrowers would be completely forgiven. So there's that. Since we do not directly observe a borrower's income, we simulate eligibility by sampling from the distribution of household income for each borrower's census block group and take the average total forgiveness over 100 simulations. So that's kind of what I'm talking about. Is like I don't really okay. That's pretty much it. Don't have much else to say besides that. Besides, why don't they just use the actual data that they get from those reports? But hmm, and that's something I would, cause that I'm kind of, I honestly, I'm not quite sure why they don't do that. So if you guys happen to know, please comment or whatever, because I don't know. So adding a household income limit of 75K reduces the total cost of 50 grand forgiveness policy from about half, right? So 904 billion to 507 billion. And so that's a reduction of 45%. Um, and a lot of the stuff that's kind of more, they start to distinguish between like age, or like who benefits. And so they found that 67% of student loan borrowers are under 40. However, only 57% of balances are owned by those under 40, showing that those with larger balances are more likely to be older, which is say likely due to borrowing for grad school, which is a lot more expensive than undergrad, depending on where you're going, obviously. But in aggregate total, grad school is a lot more expensive. Um, while no income caps do not significantly change the share of forgiveness going to each age group, increasing the forgiveness amount from 10,000 to 50,000 shifts a larger share of forgiven debt to older borrowers, right? Because again, the older borrowers are the ones who typically have more in loans, either from total duration in school or just they went further and picked up more. And so they have a lot of uh, bar graphs throughout here. I think there's like 4 or 5, and some of them are actually pretty interesting. So this one's distributed by age, and so you can tell like the 4 different policies they kind of proposed, where you have no income caps, and then you have the 50, and then you have the $75,000 income caps on the right, and each one's kind of broken up into 10 grand forgiveness and 50 grand forgiveness. And so you can see by age, um, you can tell which one. Each of these numbers is the kind of percentage share of forgiveness each one would have, right? And so you notice for both cases, when there's an increase in forgiveness, a smaller portion of the younger population, so 18 to 29, um, has forgiveness. And so it's kind of, you see that with both of them. And every other one is kind of more constant-ish. You just see when the shift happens. Um, that proportion that did go to the younger groups gets kind of moved up into the older groups. Again, kind of reinforcing that whole idea that, the higher the debt or the older borrowers tend to have more debt. Um, they also did this for neighborhood income. So borrowers living in high income areas are more likely to owe federal student loans and hold higher balances. Despite being 25% of the population, borrowers who live in high income neighborhoods hold 33% of federal balances, while borrowers residing in low income areas only hold 23%. So a lot of that's probably, the higher income areas are actually going to I guess, higher education or post-secondary school, whatever you want to call it, going to college, um, than the lower incomes. And so it's kind of going to be more weighted towards that because they're actually going. Um, and then by contrast, adding a $75,000 income cap for forgiveness eligibility significantly shifts the share of benefits. So the share of forgiven dollars going to high income areas falls from 30% to around 18%, and the share of forgiven debt going to low income areas increases from around 25 to 34%. So again, not only are so the higher income the the borrowers living in higher income areas not only are borrowing more, but they're also making more. So when you introduce this income cap, then they're no longer eligible for forgiveness. And so you can see this here where it's distributed between low, middle, and high income. So you see when you have this cap here on the right side, when we have the income cap, the um the percentage of high income decreases drastically, like almost half ish, roughly, obviously. Probably like a 40% decrease or so. And then middle income is relatively constant. I mean, it really doesn't move much. And then you really see an increase for the low income to where it goes from mid 20s to mid 30s. So that's like a 10% increase in total. They also do it by credit score. And so one thing that was good, I think, is that they used the credit scores from February 2020, which was before the delinquent federal student loan borrowers experienced large credit score increases because their accounts were marked current due to the pandemic forbearance, and so they saw kind of an artificial raise in their credit score. And under all four policies, more than half the share of forgiven debt would go to borrowers with a credit score of below 660. And so you kind of see that down here, where it's distributed via credit score. And so below 660 would be both the dark blue and the kind of orange tannish. I don't know. I have my screen has like a blue light blocker or whatever that turns on automatically when the sun's not up. So since it's so early in the morning when I'm recording, um, it's hard to tell what color this is, like orange or tan, one of the two. But you can tell how that kind of aggregate total of the two sections increases when you introduce the income cap. Basically showing that, those who have lower incomes, I'm sorry, those who have lower credit scores also have lower incomes. So when you put in that cap, they take up a higher percentage of the total that would be forgiven. Um, so yeah. And then they also do neighborhood demographics, and this one I thought was kind of cool. So those living in majority white and majority minority neighborhoods are equally likely to owe student loans. And so roughly 67% of the population and 67% of the federal student loan borrowers reside in majority white neighborhoods, and balance shares are split roughly in the same proportion. So yes, there's a higher percentage that live in majority white neighborhoods, but they have an equivalent um, proportion of the student loan debt as well. So that could be that might also be reflected into the distributed by income or neighborhood income. bar chart that we saw above, and so on. So, however, introducing an income cap of 75 grand for eligibility significantly increases the share of forgiven loans going to majority minority neighborhoods from roughly 33% of forgiven debt to 37 on both forgiveness levels. And so you just see when you introduce the income cap for the same reason we have given for the probably the past two um, kind of categories, the lower income, or I mean the majority minority um, proportion increases, possibly due to the fact that they don't. There's a smaller percentage of them that makes above 75,000, and so when you introduce the cap, you're taking out more of the majority white category, rather than majority minority, and so you're seeing that increase. So, some of their conclusions. In general, they find that smaller student loan forgiveness policies distribute a larger share of benefits to lower credit score borrowers and to those who live in less wealthy and majority minority neighborhoods relative to the share of balances they hold. Increasing the forgiveness amount increases the share of total forgiven debt for higher credit score borrowers and those living in richer neighborhoods with a majority of white residents, according to this, right? And so, as always, when you're looking at statistics like these, especially since they didn't pull directly from the credit reports for a lot of the other things, so like their demographics and so on, because I know they took what age? There we go. Maybe trying to find where I highlighted it, where they took the here. So they took the age, credit score, and the loan balance, but everything else, the individual's income and demographic information was all just taken from, um, basically simulated, it seems. So take that for what you will. And so, kind of a final note under a $10,000 policy, an income cap raises the share of forgiven loan dollars going to borrowers in low income neighborhoods from 25 to 35%, and share going to lower credit borrowers from 37 to 42%. So again, kind of showing the general trend. And so that's one thing you have to keep in mind with this kind of data is that it's more generalized, right? And so you can't really make very specific um, judgment calls on a case by case basis. It's supposed to be generalized, and that's the point. Um, and but you just have to keep that in mind whenever you're going through this kind of data. It's the difference between like macro and microeconomics, right? You're seeing one indicator on aggregate total that's basically summing over a certain amount of, in this case, individuals. Um, and so you have to keep that in mind whenever you're doing it, right? And so I guess kind of big takeaways for this is for student loan forgiveness, it seems to lower the amount, the when you lower the maximum forgiveness amount, you're lowering the cost of the whole program and you're targeting more of the lower income individuals for the whole for forgiveness. And as you increase that, you're kind of incorporating more and more of the higher income individuals who live in richer neighborhoods, um, because they are the ones who typically have more debt, and so maybe that's due to the kind of the career choices they chose, how much education they actually went after, which would obviously the more education you have or go for, the higher student loan debt will be, especially if you borrow for it. Um, and so maybe that is also why they're getting paid more is because they have more education, which is also kind of directly related to um, the amount of debt they have. So all things to just keep in mind. Um, but yeah, if you guys want to watch more or learn more about like the student loan stuff, I can keep looking for stuff. I just noticed that you guys um, have been watching the student loan ones much more often, so I thought I'd go over another one, and I might just kind of think I'll definitely research this more. As in, like, find more sources for you guys, and obviously I'll link everything like I always do. That's always a pet peeve of mine is you can't just use data and stuff and not cite where it comes from. Like, I want to read the source too. Um, and that's a problem I sometimes have with like hiring people to write. Um, I actually had one of those about a couple days ago. He gave me something with a lot of data and a lot of other stuff, and there was not a single citation in the whole thing. And when I asked for sources, it got a little dicey, we'll say the least. But anyways, that's I'm just gonna leave it at that. So if you guys want more of this stuff, feel free to put it in the comments. Just if you guys want something specific, just ask. I might look into it more. But anyways, I hope you guys have a good night, and I'll see you on the next.